I sat at the head of the long walnut table in the conference room I had built with my own two hands, looking at the people who used to call me family. The silence in that room had teeth. My son-in-law's wife, Renata, leaned across the polished wood and dropped a stack of legal papers in front of me, the sound cracking like a rifle shot. She smiled. Not a sad smile, not a nervous smile, a satisfied one. "Now that Eleanor is gone," she said, "you're going to sign the dealership over to Marcus, and you're going to disappear quietly." My daughter sat beside her husband, staring at her folded hands, refusing to look at me. They actually believed I would just hand it over. They forgot who spent 30 years building this from a single tow truck with a cracked windshield. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just smiled back, folded my hands, and waited. 4 seconds later, the double doors opened, and my attorney, Gordon Pierce, walked in without a word. He set a single sealed envelope in front of Renata and stepped back into the shadows. "Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, and how I brought down everyone who tried to bury me while I was still breathing, tell me where you're watching from tonight, my friend, and if you've ever had family try to take what you built, hit that like button for me." Let's go back 3 days, so you understand exactly how we got to that table. The house still smelled like the lilies from the funeral. My Eleanor was gone, taken by a stroke that gave us no warning and no goodbye, after 42 years of marriage. The kitchen felt like a held breath. I stood at the sink rinsing out her favorite coffee mug, the one with the chipped handle she refused to throw away, just to keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't wander to the empty side of the bed. That's when I heard the click of heels on the hardwood, sharp and businesslike, coming down the hallway like she owned the place. Renata walked into my kitchen in a tailored charcoal suit, dry-eyed, not a hair out of place, like she was headed into a hostile takeover instead of mourning her mother-in-law. She dropped a thick folder on the counter without so much as asking how I was holding up. Across the top, in bold letters, it read "Transition of Ownership Agreement." "What is this, Renata?" I asked, keeping my voice level. She sighed like she was talking to a stubborn child. "It's for your own good, Walt. You're 68. You just buried Eleanor. You're not thinking clearly. And Sterling Auto Group needs someone steady at the wheel. Marcus is ready." Marcus was my 20-year-old grandson, a boy who'd failed his community college accounting class twice and spent more time posting videos of himself revving a car he didn't own than looking at a balance sheet. I stared at those papers and felt something cold settle in my gut. Sterling Auto Group wasn't just a business. It was Eleanor and me, 23 years old, $400 in a shoebox, and one rusted-out tow truck we bought at auction. We slept in that truck some nights so we could save enough for our first lot. Eleanor kept the books by lamplight while I worked 16-hour days, pulling cars out of ditches in the snow. And now, 5 days after I put her in the ground, my own daughter's husband's family wanted the keys handed to a boy who couldn't balance his own checkbook. I didn't yell. In this business, the man who loses his temper loses the negotiation. "The company's running fine," I said. "I'm grieving, Renata. I'm not incapacitated." Right on cue, my daughter Paige walked in behind her husband Trevor, who put a soft hand on my shoulder like he'd rehearsed it in the mirror. Trevor was 39 years old, wearing a watch I paid for, living in a house I helped finance. "Dad, please, just hear her out," he said, voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "Your blood pressure's been through the roof since Mom got sick. We're scared for you. Just sign it. Let Marcus hold the title in trust, and Renata and I will run the daily operations. You can finally rest." It sounded so caring. It was a beautiful, convenient lie. I'd spent a small fortune sending Trevor to business school, and all it produced was a man who couldn't make a decision without his wife's permission. I looked at the gold pen Renata had thoughtfully placed beside the folder. "I'll think about it," I said quietly. "I need time to read the fine print before I sign anything that matters." Trevor nodded, relieved I hadn't refused outright. "Take your time, Dad. Just don't wait too long. The market's shifting." They walked out together, and through the reflection in the dark kitchen window, I watched Renata pause in the hallway, pull out her phone, and whisper something to herself with a smirk before tucking it away. "The old man's taking the bait," she muttered. "Prep the paperwork." I didn't sleep that night. The house without Eleanor felt like a lung with a hole punched through it. By 5:30 the next morning, I was pulling into the executive lot at the dealership headquarters, the one building on the property that still felt like mine. I badged into the side door, nodded to the overnight security guard, and walked straight for the records office at the end of the hall, past my own office. Because if Renata and Trevor were planning something, the paper trail would be sitting in those file cabinets, not on some server they could scrub. I swiped my master key card at the records door. The reader blinked red. I swiped it again. Red. A third time. Nothing. Having some trouble there, Walt? The voice came from behind me, too pleased with itself for 5:30 in the morning. Preston Cole stepped out of the break room, our chief financial officer, 44 years old, wearing enough cologne to strip paint. His smile stretched a little too wide. "Oh, right. I should have mentioned it," he said. "We're running a full security overhaul this week." Trevor authorized it. "Figured you'd be taking some time off to grieve, so he got ahead of it." "Trevor authorized it," I repeated slowly. Preston just nodded, unbothered, telling me not to worry, that everything was under control, that I should go home and rest. I looked into his eyes and saw exactly what I needed to see. Cold. Calculating. Amused. They were locking me out of my own company and using my son-in-law as the mask. The old me would have grabbed him by the collar, but I'd spent 4 decades in rooms just like this one, and I knew that showing anger here would only hand them the one thing they needed, proof that grief had made me unstable. "Suppose an upgrade's overdue," I said, and walked calmly back to my office, locking the door behind me. 10 years earlier, half expecting something like this someday, I'd installed a hidden drive in the bottom drawer of my desk, behind a biometric lock only I knew existed. I pressed my thumb to the panel. It clicked open. Inside sat an external hard drive holding an offline mirror of every financial record Sterling Auto Group had ever generated. I connected it to my laptop and began entering the encryption sequence, my finger hovering over the final key, ready to see exactly what Renata and Preston had been hiding in the books. Before I could press it, my private cell phone rang, a number almost nobody had. I answered. A woman's voice, calm but urgent. "Mr. Sterling, this is Riverside Memorial. We're calling about your grandson, Casey. He's been in a serious car accident and is currently in our trauma unit. We need family here immediately." I slammed the laptop shut, shoved the drive back into its hidden compartment, and ran. The digital war would have to wait. My grandson was bleeding somewhere across town. Casey was 19, reckless behind the wheel, more interested in his phone than the road, but he was still the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during Sunday drives, the one Eleanor doted on more than anyone. I broke every speed limit getting there, abandoned my car in the ambulance bay, and pushed through the sliding doors into the sting of hospital light and the smell of bleach and burnt coffee. I found them at the end of the hallway, Renata pacing in her heels, scrolling her phone, more inconvenienced than afraid. Trevor slumped in a plastic chair, pale, sweating through his shirt. "Dad," he choked out when he saw me. "What happened? How bad is it?" His eyes flicked toward Renata before he answered, like he needed permission to speak. He said Casey lost control, merging onto the highway, clipped a guardrail, flipped twice. Helmet wasn't required for a car, so there was a deep gash along his side and heavy blood loss before paramedics arrived. Renata crossed her arms and sighed like the whole thing was a scheduling conflict. "We were supposed to finalize the ownership transfer this afternoon. Now we're stuck here." I stared at her, stunned by how little she seemed to care that her son was in surgery. Before I could say anything, the trauma doors opened, and a tired-looking doctor in a blood-stained coat stepped out. "Family of Casey Whitfield," he called. We circled him tightly. He said Casey was stable for now, the bleeding controlled, but his blood counts were dangerously low, and he needed a transfusion immediately or he'd go into shock. "Then do it," Renata snapped, waving a manicured hand. "Give him blood and patch him up so we can leave this depressing place." The doctor's expression hardened. "It's not that simple, ma'am. Your son has a rare type. He's AB positive. We had a multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate this week, and our AB reserves are critically low. We need direct family donors right now to cross-match immediately." The hallway went silent in my ears. The hum of the vents disappeared. AB positive. My mind, trained for 3 decades to catch a single misplaced decimal in a balance sheet, latched onto something far more devastating than any spreadsheet error. I am O positive. Eleanor was O positive. 2 O-type parents cannot, under any law of biology, produce a child who carries the B antigen. My daughter Paige, Casey's mother, was O-type as well. I remembered clearly from a transfusion scare years back when she'd had her appendix out. an O-type mother, and whoever fathered that boy could produce an A child, possibly an O child, but never, under any circumstance, an AB child. That B trait had to come from somewhere, and it wasn't from Paige's side of this family. There was only one impossible conclusion standing in front of me in that fluorescent hallway. Casey, the boy I had loved for 19 years, the boy set to inherit everything I had built, did not carry a single drop of Sterling blood. I turned toward Paige, my own daughter. She was gripping the guardrail beside the wall, staring at the floor, not at the doctor, not at her husband, not at me. Trevor stood a few feet from her, wringing his hands, refusing to meet my eyes. I had expected confusion. I had expected a father demanding the lab run the test again. Instead, I saw two people who already knew and had known for a long, long time. My daughter finally lifted her head, and for one unbearable second, our eyes met across that sterile hallway. She saw that I had done the math. She looked away first. Renata, meanwhile, was already pulling out a platinum card, shoving it at the doctor, demanding he charter a helicopter from a private facility regardless of cost, more interested in controlling the scene than in what had just cracked open in front of her. The doctor nodded and disappeared back through the doors. And in the silence that followed, the four of us stood on a foundation that had just fractured straight down the middle. I didn't confront anyone in that hallway. Cornering a wounded animal in public is a mistake I learned to avoid decades ago, at negotiating tables far less personal than this one. I suggested Paige and I get coffee from the cafeteria while we waited on the transport. She hesitated, glanced at Trevor, who gave the smallest nod, and followed me down to the basement, where the fluorescent lights buzzed over cheap plastic tables and the coffee tasted like burnt tar. She wrapped both hands around her cup like it was the only solid thing left in the room. I took a slow sip and set my cup down. "That was quite a scene up there," I said, keeping my voice even. "I have to admit, I'm confused, sweetheart. The doctor said Casey's AB positive. You're O. I'm O. Your mother was O. How does a boy with those parents end up AB positive?" Paige flinched like I'd slapped her. The color drained from her face, and instead of confusion, instead of demanding they rerun the test, she reacted the way only someone hiding something reacts. "You're grieving, Dad, and you're not thinking straight," she snapped, her voice cracking. "It's a lab error. It happens all the time in these places. Don't turn my son's accident into one of your investigations." I sat perfectly still and let her outburst wash over me. I'd spent 30 years across tables from men trying to bury the truth under righteous anger, and I knew exactly what real confusion sounded like, and exactly what guilt dressed up as offense sounded like. If she believed it was a lab mistake, she would have laughed it off, tired and irritated. Instead, she attacked me, using my grief as a shield. That told me everything. I sat with that grief quietly, the rest of that long night in the waiting room, watching my daughter avoid my eyes, watching Trevor pretend to scroll through work emails that didn't exist. Casey came through the transfusion and the surgery that followed. When he was finally stable and sleeping, I drove home alone in the dark, and for the first time since Eleanor's funeral, I didn't cry for her. I sat in my driveway, and I planned. I thought of every account Preston Cole had touched in the last 18 months, every executive he'd quietly pushed out under Renata's direction, every locked door that had appeared the week Eleanor was buried. If they thought a grieving old man was too broken to notice a stolen empire, they had badly misjudged who raised who in this family. The following morning I called Gordon Pierce, the only attorney I trusted completely, a man who had drafted every contract Sterling Auto Group had signed for 15 years. I told him everything, the locked archive, Preston's cologne, and his lies about a security overhaul, the blood type that didn't add up. Gordon didn't say much. He asked for 48 hours and a copy of everything on that hidden drive. What he found, once his forensic accountant tore into the numbers, made my stomach turn in an entirely different way than grief ever had. Over the past 3 years, nearly $2.8 million had been siphoned out of Sterling Auto Group through a shell logistics vendor that didn't actually exist. Invoices approved personally by Preston Cole and quietly authorized under Trevor's signature, though Gordon believed Trevor barely understood what he was signing. The money had moved through 2 accounts in the Cayman Islands, before finally landing somewhere that made Gordon go very quiet on the phone. It landed in an account tied to a man named Curtis Boone. Curtis Boone, Gordon informed me, had once been engaged to my daughter Paige 20 years ago, before Trevor came along. Before I could ask the question forming in my throat, Gordon answered it for me. Curtis Boone's blood type, according to an old donor registry pulled during a civil suit years back, was AB positive. I sat with the phone against my ear in my empty kitchen and finally understood the shape of the lie my family had been living inside for 19 years. Paige had been involved with Curtis before she married Trevor. Casey wasn't a mistake from a stranger. Casey was Curtis Boone's son, born 7 months into her marriage, passed off in a hurry, and Trevor, weak as he was, had chosen to raise another man's child rather than lose the comfortable life marrying into the Sterling name provided him. And somewhere along the way, whether out of guilt, blackmail, or something uglier, Curtis Boone had found his way back into my company's finances through Preston Cole, bleeding my life's work dry while wearing Trevor's signature as a shield. Gordon told me quietly that federal wire fraud statutes made this a matter for the FBI, not just civil court, given the interstate banking involved. And he had already made a call to a contact in the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division. I did not confront Renata. I did not confront Trevor. I did not confront my own daughter, though every part of me wanted to sit her down and ask her how long she planned on letting me love a lie. Instead, I did what I had done for 40 years when a competitor thought they'd outmaneuvered me. I waited, I gathered everything, and I let them believe they'd already won. 2 weeks later, Renata called a full ownership transfer meeting, certain the grieving old fool had finally folded. She wanted every executive present, wanted witnesses to my surrender. I agreed to every demand she made over the phone, and I could hear the triumph in her voice before we even hung up. The morning of the meeting, I sat at the head of that long walnut table, the same table where Eleanor and I had signed our very first franchise agreement 20 years earlier, and I watched Renata walk in wearing a smile she couldn't have wiped off with a crowbar. Trevor sat beside her, unable to look at me, already looking like a man being led to something he couldn't stop. Preston Cole sat further down the table, adjusting his cufflinks, entirely too relaxed for a man whose entire fraud was about to collapse. Renata slid her papers across to me and delivered her line about the old woman being gone and it being time for me to disappear quietly. I smiled, folded my hands, and 4 seconds later Gordon Pierce walked through those double doors, flanked by 2 federal agents in plain suits who did not need to raise their voices to command the room. Gordon set the sealed envelope in front of Renata. Inside was the forensic accounting report, the wire transfer trail, and the DNA comparison Gordon had quietly obtained through the hospital records with a court order once Casey's transfusion made the paternity question medically relevant. Special Agent Diane Kowalski, who had been working the shell company for months once Gordon alerted the Bureau, stepped forward and read Preston Cole, his rights on the spot, informing the room that a warrant was already prepared for Curtis Boone's arrest in a separate jurisdiction. Preston did not resist. He simply sat there, pale, his silk tie hanging loose, understanding that his arrogance had finally cost him everything. Renata's screaming filled that boardroom in a way I will never forget, demanding this was a mistake, that I had orchestrated some kind of frame job, until the second agent quietly informed her that the shell account funds had, in fact, been traced partially into a joint account under her own name as well, a detail Curtis Boone had apparently never bothered to mention to her. Trevor said nothing. He sat frozen, staring at the table, his hands trembling, a man who had spent 19 years pretending not to know the truth so he wouldn't have to face losing the only comfortable life he'd ever known. When the room had finally emptied of agents and executives scrambling for the door, I walked the length of that table and stopped beside his chair. I did not put a hand on his shoulder. I dropped a single sheet of paper into his lap, an eviction notice for the home I had financed for him and Paige, along with immediate termination of his position and his removal from every trust document bearing the Sterling name. "You have 24 hours, I told him, my voice steady as granite. "You made your choice 19 years ago when you decided silence was easier than the truth. I hope it was worth it." He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply nodded, tears sliding down a face that had run out of excuses. I turned to Casey, who had been sitting quietly in the corner where I'd asked Gordon to have him wait once the story broke, old enough now to understand what his own accident had accidentally exposed. He looked at me with the same frightened, lost expression I imagine I wore the night I found out my whole family's foundation was built on sand. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't change things, Casey," I told him gently, my voice softer than the one I'd used with Trevor. You didn't ask to be born into any of this, and none of what happened is your fault. You are not my blood, but you were raised in my house, and that has to mean something, even now. I told him I would cover his tuition in full and set aside enough to help him get his own start, not as an heir to an empire, but as a young man beginning his own life honestly, something none of the adults around him had managed to do. He nodded, quiet, grateful in a way that told me he understood exactly how much worse this could have gone for him. As for my own daughter, I did not disown her the way I did her husband. Blood may not have made Casey mine, but Paige had been mine since the day I held her in a hospital room 40 years ago, and 19 years of a painful, misguided secret didn't erase that. Even if it changed everything about how I looked at her now, we are still working through it, slowly, in the quiet, careful way people rebuild something after an earthquake. She is in therapy. So am I, if I am honest with you, my friend. Because grief and betrayal arriving in the same month will break a man if he tries to carry both alone. 6 months passed. The federal case against Preston Cole and Curtis Boone moved with the slow, grinding certainty that justice sometimes takes, but it moved. Preston was sentenced to 12 years for wire fraud and grand embezzlement. Curtis Boone, once the evidence of the shell accounts and years of quiet blackmail against Trevor came fully to light, received 14. Renata's name was cleared of criminal charges once investigators confirmed she hadn't known where the money in her account originated, though I noticed she filed for divorce from Trevor within a month of the arrests, unwilling to stay tied to a man with nothing left to offer her. Trevor moved into a small apartment across town and found work managing inventory at a hardware store, the first job he'd ever held that I hadn't arranged for him. I won't pretend I feel sorry for him. He had 19 years to tell the truth and chose comfort instead. Every single time. I spent those 6 months rebuilding Sterling Auto Group with the same stubborn determination Eleanor and I poured into it from that first rusted tow truck. I brought back every manager Renata had pushed out, gave them their titles and a heartfelt apology alongside a bonus they'd earned tenfold. Together with federal investigators, we traced every stolen dollar through the offshore accounts, and every cent, all $2.8 million, was eventually recovered and returned directly into the employee pension fund, because the people who actually built this company with their hands were never going to pay for what a handful of liars had done in my name. On a cold, clear morning, almost exactly a year after I buried Eleanor, I stood on the rooftop of our headquarters with Gordon beside me, holding a leather folder of documents that would permanently reshape everything I owned. I signed without hesitation. Half of my personal fortune went into a new scholarship fund bearing Eleanor's name, meant for kids working 2 jobs to put themselves through school the way we once dreamed we'd be able to for our own children. The other half was placed into an employee ownership program, so that this company would never again belong to someone simply because of the family they were born into, but to the people who showed up every single day and earned it. I made sure Casey's fund was separate from all of it, protected, untouched by any of this, because whatever Blood said, that boy did not deserve to inherit the consequences of choices he never made. I stood at the edge of that rooftop looking out over the city Eleanor and I built our whole life around, and I understood something I wish I'd known 30 years earlier. Family was never about a blood type on a hospital chart or a name on a company sign. It was about who stayed, who told you the truth even when it cost them everything, and who chose you back every single day, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I lost a wife. I lost a son-in-law. I lost the illusion of a grandson tied to me by blood, but I gained back my daughter. Slowly, painfully, honestly, and for the first time since Eleanor passed, that felt like enough to build on. A man can lose almost everything he thought he had, and still walk away standing, as long as he remembers exactly what he's fighting to protect, and who's actually worth protecting it for. Blood tells you where someone came from, but it never tells you who they'll become or who will stand beside you when the truth finally breaks. Real family shows up honestly, even after the hardest year of your life. If someone chooses you back every day without needing to, hold on to that tighter than any name or inheritance. That's the wealth worth building. A small note for you, my friend. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope the heart of it still leaves you with something warm and true to carry forward.